welcome all of you to the second day of the 28th edition of the Nigerian Economic Summit. So far, we have heard 3 plenary sessions. And the beauty of the plenary sessions is that they are virtually linked in terms of concept and design. We kicked off yesterday with the plenary that focused on the Nigeria that we all desire and want. And part of that, in terms of going away from the holistic view of Nigeria from the federal level, the plenary, the second plenary, started looking at the sub-national perspectives to economic viability. Plenary 3 also extended the conversation into responsible, responsive, and resilient leadership, which will lead us to the plenary this morning, which is envisioning Nigeria's future workforce. Please join me as I first and foremost welcome this morning and say good morning to the chairman of the board of the NESG, Mr. Aswe Ighodalo. I welcome you this morning. Thank you very much. And let me also welcome our father here, a founding father. It's also beautiful that when those people that gave birth to a project will be alive to see it grow into adulthood. Mr. Pascal Doze, we say thank you very much and welcome. I have a few friends in the political space who are jostling to be governors. While the incumbent is still there, they are calling themselves incoming. So let me welcome incoming too this morning. Good morning. The CEO doesn't love to be mentioned, but I welcome you too. Let me welcome all of you, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Very quickly, let me invite the panel. Our moderator is Ms. Nkendilim Waje Bego, CEO, Future Software Resources Limited. Welcome you. Thank you very much. And these are members of the panel. Professor Abubakar Adamu Rashid, Executive Secretary, National Universities Commission, NUC. Chinenye Mba Uzuku, will be joining us here. He is the managing partner, Grand Central. Professor Enase Okonedo, Vice Chancellor of Pan Atlantic University. You're welcome. Mr. Abubakar Suleiman, Managing Director of Sterling Bank. And Mr. Collins Onwebu, Executive Vice Chairman, Signal Alliance Technology Holding.
(2023) and beyond. Priorities for shared prosperity. Nigeria's workforce is projected to have over 244 young people by 2050. According to the United Nations, Nigeria will have the world's 3rd largest population. With this impending boom and the present unemployment reality in the country, which stands at 33.3% as of 2021 National Bureau of Statistics, there is a need to reposition our workforce to take advantage of this opportunity to become one of the world's most viable economies. Plenary 4. Envisioning Nigeria's future workforce. This plenary is interpreted for our virtual audience in Pidgin, Hausa, Igbo, French, and Yoruba. Follow the on-screen instructions to gain access. Ladies and gentlemen, please make welcome our panelists for this plenary.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nkemdilim, and I'll be your moderator for this plenary today. I think the video has said quite a lot in terms of the type of workforce that we currently have and the type of workforce that we require for the future. The workforce is estimated at 244 million by 2050, and we currently have about 33.3% unemployed people within our workforce. To me, one of the things that's really important is the fact that globally we're shifting towards the knowledge economy, which also requires different types of skills that we currently do not have. The National Development Plan 2021 to 2025 has identified job creation as a key driver for socioeconomic development and sort of sustenance of our nation. There's also the strategic framework for job creation that addresses the implementation of actually creating those jobs. And I think it's really important to have these different frameworks. However, the question is, what are we actually doing to really move the needle? How do we make sure that by 2025, by 2050, the workforce that we have is actually engaged? And we have to make sure that whatever we're doing today really has a good balance of what we need in the now and what we're going to need in the future. And with that, I would like to go to my esteemed panelists. When we think about the future workforce, right, we think about the fact that we have a population of 75% of Nigerians that are under 25. And a lot of people see this largely unemployed youth population as a curse. So my question is, how do we turn it into a blessing or an opportunity for our country and the continent at large? And I'd like every one of you to just speak to it as short as possible, so that everyone can sort of add to it. So Abu, we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you very much. Short as possible, the problem we have is we do have raw material, which is the population we talk about, but we don't have a process for converting them so that they can become very productive. Go as far as saying that the process we have today, which is a tertiary education model, may actually be obsolete. I remember Thomas Rudnick, the Canadian reformer, once asking me the question after I had explained to him all our effort. He asked, are we trying to optimize obsolescence? And the more I think about it, I think sometimes we are optimizing obsolescence. Let's be clear, the university education was not designed to create jobs. The primary purpose of academia was to actually lead to a higher level of intellectual engagement, which would then lead to other things. You are now trying to use that system to create jobs. And it's very difficult to expand. We've moved from 20,000 students in higher institutions in 1970 to over 2 million today. That kind of breakneck scale, that kind of growth will break anything. So the system is broken. Do we have the courage to rethink it? And I suspect that it's being forced on us now. We now have to create an education system that is equivalent or comparable to tertiary education with the sole purpose of creating jobs. That model means that the university campus may not actually be the best place to educate people. The workplaces may actually now become the best place to educate these people. All we need to do is to have a firm handshake with the university campuses so that the academic content of that is also solid. To my mind, we need to ask ourselves, do we have the courage to rethink tertiary education that happens in the workplace, that is designed to train people for work, and therefore almost certain to lead to work rather than unemployment?
Thank you very much. Chineye?
I see 75% as an opportunity, not a curse. I think we have an opportunity around retooling and reskilling that 75% and making them an effective part of our economy. So long as we fail to do that, they become a burden. And nobody's born a burden. We're all born with opportunity, and it is incumbent on our society to build a pathway for everyone to be able to realize their full potential. As it sits right now, within that 75%, we have, just taking off of Abu's numbers, about 2 million people in Nigerian universities, right? So these universities, 2 million is, 1% of our population. And so you start to ask yourself whether a country can actually grow and can actually achieve its potential as an economy with only 1% of its population in schools. At the tertiary level, we're graduating maybe about 500,000 every year. The big challenge is that over these years of our development, those ratios have not fundamentally changed. And yet the demand for capacity is not necessarily at tertiary. In fact, the biggest problem we have, there was a study done by the federal government, I think in 1986, that said the carrying capacity of our senior secondary schools, which is the route to tertiary education, is 14% of the students in JS3, which means that 86% of our children will literally stop their education after junior secondary 3. And you only have 14% going on to senior secondary. And within that 14%, we're still only able to admit about 700 or 800,000 every year into the universities. So what you're seeing is almost like a pipeline that is constricted. It starts, or if you like, a pyramid that's really broad at the base, but very narrow, very narrow at the top in terms of the opportunity it provides. So I think, like Abu has said, the key thing for us now is to take that pyramid and kind of like open it up a little bit. So we have much more capacity, particularly in the middle. And this is where I believe the focus has to be. The bulk of those youth who should be part of the workforce will not go to university. So we need to create some strength around our TVET system, which currently, I think the last figures I saw were about 540,000 in terms of total enrollments in technical and vocational education in Nigeria. That number should be somewhere in the close of 5 million. So we're seriously underperforming in the most critical area where we enable people to have jobs and opportunity to have careers.
Thank you so much. Enase, over to you.
Thank you. I do agree with the previous speakers. Education is the key. If we're going to turn the youth population into a gain rather than a cost. But I would like us to focus not necessarily on tertiary education, but to go a bit further than that. Because at every level, we need skills to contribute to a vibrant economy, to contribute to the development of society. That contribution is not going to only to come from those who get into the university system. And Chien has told us about, the population, the small population that does get into tertiary, but we have to come a bit lower, even beginning from literacy and numerical skills from the very beginning. And then you talked about the percentage that we lose from JS to university, but perhaps we need to go further. Of every 10 million that enroll in primary, by the time we're getting to secondary, we've lost about 40%. And then we have 6 million that go into secondary. And then by the time they're ready to go to universities there, we have more or less 1.7 to 2 million that are applying. And then the ones that actually, so, we're losing people along the way. And I think the question that we're going to ask is that if we have such a huge youth population, what happens to those that we lose across the way? What it is that they're being, channeled into? We talked about TVET. How many do we have? What is the capacity to be able to absorb those? And for those who do not aspire to go any of those routes, what are we doing in terms of entrepreneurship? Yes, we do things when it comes to tertiary, but then before them, what are we going to do? So the key is education. But I think we need to take a holistic approach and look at it even from early childhood education up until tertiary in order to see how this youth population can be a gain rather than a cost.
Thank you so much. Abubakar, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I share the submissions by the previous speakers. Education is a fundamental human right, and it holds a special place in the minds and the hearts of people across history and across the world, all over. Now, the focus here, we are discussing workforce. And it is interesting, the first thing people think of workforce is to look at, to say, universities. But in reality, as the previous speakers have indicated, only about 2 million of our population are currently in the university. That is about 1% of the population. And everybody knows that workforce in relation to education, historically from the Plato, Aristotle's time, I mean, it's not just looking at the philosophers, not looking just at the the university level, but all kinds of skills and unskilled needed. You look at construction industry in this country. You are not waiting for engineers, civil engineers, and building engineers to be the people. You are looking at, yes, an engineer to think, or to design, or to implement, or to execute, but along the way, you need people who have been trained in plumbing, in tiling, in painting, in this. There are so many other skills. So we really need to focus on talking about skills in this country. It's a mixture. Probably for every one single engineer, you require 6, 7, 8 OND or some diploma students and diploma graduates. And you also, for every one of them, you also require the lower level people. So I think we really need to rethink our education content and purpose in this country. We need to rethink the purpose of education. We need to rethink the content, and that is the curriculum of education in Nigeria, to align it with the needs of the nation. Yes, we need people like us sitting down here to speak English, to do this, but we cannot move the country alone. In the oil sector, the underwater welders of the pipe and so on, they don't require a university degree, but they are so critical or crucial to well. So I think my submission at this level is to, yes, emphasize the importance, the fundamental significance of education, the need to invest in education, the need to treat education investment as an asset, not a liability, the need to see schools, universities, and so on, as I say, as assets, not as public liabilities, but then the need for all of us to have the courage to rethink the purpose and the content of our education. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Collins?
Yeah, thank you. 75%, is it a cause or a blessing? I think it could be any, depending on how we look at it. But I want to just give an example of, if you think about the oil industry in Nigeria today, in a former industrial revolution, we had the raw materials, which was oil, to transform ourselves, and we didn't transform oil, and we exported oil. And our economy depended on oil. In this current industrial revolution, the raw material is people. And I think we are following the same pathway. So what we're doing now is that a few people who are educated are going to go abroad, and sometimes our policy seems to focus on those people who went abroad to bring remittances home, just as we get dollar from oil. So if we don't take time, we're going to make the same mistakes where we export the few skills we can export, either the children of the rich who travel abroad and educate, and then they send money home as their diaspora remittance. And then we just leave the other 75% to fend for themselves and then produce whatever they produce for us. So I think we should be careful of the mistake we've made with oil, because in this current revolution, it is not people. And if we make the same mistake, what we're going to have is that for the foreseeable future, our policy will focus more on diaspora remittance from those who have escaped, instead of looking at how to get this 75% to transform us ourselves. If that happens, we're just going to have the same experience with oil.
Thank you so much. And I really like the different points that were made. I think the one that stood out the most was really to look at education as an investment and to look at our people as our biggest asset, right? And I think once we sort of transform the way that we think and shift our minds to see the people as where we need to invest, then we'll also see sort of differences. And I think the National Development Plan, sort of has a really good roadmap to how we can achieve that, just like the strategic framework for job creation as well. But I think there's sort of a little bit of a disconnect, right? And between a plan and the actual steps that it takes to really implement. And I think there seem to be a lot of different initiatives that all of you have mentioned that try and implement, but it's not sort of like a cohesive effort. And so, Abu, I'd like to ask you, what do you think should we do to actually, I guess, take action and really pull all of this together? And what would you say is the role of the private sector in all of that? Because it's very easy to always point at government and to say, you should, and like we don't have this, but I think everyone sort of also mentioned that private sector does have a role, so I'd like you to expand on that a little bit.
Okay, thank you. I absolutely am not one of those that will point at government. In fact, I believe that sometimes government is trying to do too much, and that's why we're in trouble. I would like to sort of pick up from where Professor Rashid mentioned that we need to rethink the purpose of education. The consequences of rethinking the purpose of education is that we also have to rethink the places of education. Because once the purpose changes, the places where education needs to happen also change dramatically. Let me be clear, it's very difficult to convince a Nigerian child today that they shouldn't get a degree, right? It's become almost an identity. So we're not trying to say that people should not aspire to a degree. We are saying that the journey to a degree needs to pass through the workplace. We may have 200 universities today trying to offer education. We have 200,000 workplaces today that can offer education. And the trick is that in those 200,000 places or more that we have, roughly over 90% of Nigerians that have gone through high quality university education are resident in those places. And so if we rethink the places for education, those people also become part of the human resources available to enable education. That thinking is how you move from 2 million to 5 million to 10 million. It's not by building more universities or doubling the population of existing universities. That idea that there are so many of us educators that needs to be activated. If I spend a week with Professor Okonedo, I might actually be able to start teaching because I've learned how some of the skills that she has. Now, going back to the issue of how do we actually practicalize the plan that we've put in place, I think there is a repeated mistake in this country of thinking that Nigeria is so simple that you can write a single policy and it sort of work everywhere. Nigeria is multiple countries, really. And to that extent, when you have something as exciting as the work that was done, we need to localize it at the state level. Because not all of it is applicable in all of the states. So if we can convince the state to effectively take those and sort of reduce it to what is applicable, it becomes a simpler document, much more executable that can be done. But to my mind, the way we create jobs, and I think that was the comment that was made about how this industrial revolution, the raw materials people, the way we create jobs is actually to insert Nigerian youth in the global value chain. It's as simple as that. Until we start to create the kind of talent that can become part of the global value chain, what would happen is that we'll be consuming things that are made elsewhere and we'll have nothing to give in return. In the past, we gave oil in return. Now that model doesn't work anymore. We are not yet industrialized enough to export in return. What we can do, and do very quickly, is to enable our young people who can sit down anywhere in Nigeria and become part of the global economy and start to earn in foreign exchange, and therefore make it possible really for the country to become competitive. So at this point, the fastest path to making Nigeria a viable part of the trade ecosystem is for us to rely on our people, because we have models that in 6 to 9 months to 12 months, people can actually start to earn way above the minimum wage, and they can do this while they're learning. My final comment on this is, as we try to solve for jobs, let's recognize that the social problem of people wanting a university education is real.
So let us create job learning profile that will still lead them to university education. They just don't have to spend 4 years learning before they go back to work. From day one that they've started learning, they are also in the workplace. Maybe after a year, they get a certificate because they've acquired certain kind of knowledge. After 2 years, maybe they get a diploma because they've added additional knowledge. And maybe 3 years down the line, they can get a degree that has become something they desire deeply from a social perspective. In that way, we are bringing education, the university, the tertiary system, we're bringing it into the workplace. We're no longer waiting for the university to generate the workforce. We actually are now the sources of our workforce. What we are taking from them is their model of education that people still require.
Thank you so much. You touched on a lot of very pertinent points, and I think for me, one of the things that you talked about was, sort of creating people who can plug into the global value chain. And I think to some degree, this is already happening. However, we have a demand and supply problem at the moment, right? So we have the Japa movement where most of our best talent is actually leaving Nigeria and seeking opportunities to earn in foreign currency, to work in better environments, to work in more innovative workplaces across the globe. And I think when you look at that and you look at the combination with the ASU strike that just ended, we start having a real supply chain problem, right? Where there's not enough supply and the demand is very high. The demand is not just local, but also global. And I'm sure that everyone on this panel is struggling with hiring good talent and with talent constantly leaving, right? When you look, especially in technology, attrition rates are through the roof, where you're losing a third of your engineering department in 1 year, right? But there's no one to sort of replace. And when you replace, you're replacing with junior talent that is just not as good, which means that your entire, sort of the stability of your business is at risk. So Enase, I would like to, sort of come to you for that, right? How do we make sure that we sort of reverse that brain drain, right? And how do we ensure that we have enough talent for both the local market as well as the global market? Because at the end of the day, if we have talent to export, and India is a really great example of exporting talent. There was someone who said, oh, the CEO of Twitter, well, not anymore, but former CEO of Twitter, Microsoft and all the big tech giants, they're all Indian. And they were like, how did that happen? It's because India invested in human capacity development within technology as far back as 30 years, right? And they've created that value chain and that supply element. So I think for me is how do we, first of all, accelerate our talent pipeline in order to actually replenish talent? And what do we do to sort of solve this supply and demand problem that we currently have?
Thank you. So let me start from the last part, is that what can we do to sort of grow our local talent? And just sort of piggybacking on what it is that Abu has said, I think the first thing that we have to recognize and accept is that between industry and academia, there's a mutual dependency, which should be fostered. In other words, why do we complain that we're trying to find people and we can't hire them? But we have universities. We're graduating X number of students every year. Why are they not prepared for industry? Why can't we hire those? So perhaps there's a disconnect between what it is that industry is seeking and what we're preparing the students for. Now, when we recognize that we're dependent on one another, in order to prepare students to be able to serve industry, we need to understand what is industry seeking. Industry as well has to know that if they want to grow the talent pipeline, they need to work more closely with us. And I think that there are a number of factors that will be critical to that happening. After the recognition, the second thing is to foster partnerships and collaboration. How will that happen? Now, when people say, we hear all sorts of accusations, targeted at academia. They say, oh, the research that you're doing is not relevant. Do you open your doors to say, okay, come in, let's look at the problems, and then present those ones so that we can then do research that is focused on solving the nation's economic and socio-political problems. Now, for that to happen, that collaboration has to be in place. The second, and I think that we spoke about, we can sort of prepare people to do degrees over a period of time rather than just the 4-year. Now, to be able to do that, what it is that you just spoke about, we need to be able to present opportunities for students to intern within those organizations. I would have liked to, if this was a class, I would have taken a poll of this room and said how many of us in our respective organizations consistently offer internship places to students within the Nigerian universities to come in there. That's part of understanding that we need to work together to grow this talent pipeline. So the second is what opportunities exist and are created on a consistent basis within industry for students to intern. The other is that when we talk about the skills that students need, if we're talking about growing local talent, I believe that all too often we're focused on perhaps the theoretical and skills. But if I ask any CEO, what is it that you seek? Yes, we need the subject matter expertise, but most times they're looking for competences. So they're looking for critical abilities. They're looking for problem-solving abilities. They're looking for communication skills. They're looking, now, if you make this known, are we preparing people within our universities for those? So that's really how we can try and see what we can do to develop the local talent. To the second part of your question, which is what can we do to reverse the brain drain? I think that, it will be perhaps foolhardy for us to think that we can do that only by the education. We need to look at why are people leaving. Why do people leave? They leave for safety, they leave for security, they leave for economic opportunities, they leave for educational opportunities for their children. And until we fix those things, people will not remain. So rather than us trying to address the symptom of, let's stop these people from leaving, why don't we begin to think about how can we get these people to want to remain, just so that they can be part of the solution? And we need to address those before we then come to education. Because we're losing a lot. I think all of us know what the cost of the brain drain is. To reverse it, opportunities have to be here. And then, where do those opportunities come from? What sort of jobs are being created? And maybe when we think about jobs, we think about the formal sector. But if we think about the informal sector and how large it is, the contribution of small and medium enterprises to GDP, the percentage of people in the workforce that are employed by small businesses, then we will think about what incentives are in place to grow those businesses. So, we can't just take, one approach to looking at it. It is a holistic approach that cuts across all aspects of the economy. But I'll pause for now and share more thoughts later.
Okay, thank you so much. I love the fact that you talked about that handshake between academia and industry, and I think it's really, really important because that's the only way that we can create a workforce that is relevant, right? And one thing that you talked about was sort of R&D, and a country that does this really well is South Korea. South Korea has really sort of ingrained R&D that is driven by the private sector, where universities have centers that are private sector driven centers. They have lecturers that come in from the private sector. They're solving private sector problems, and that's why you see so much innovation actually coming out of South Korea. And while we're on South Korea, they are one of the countries that actually spend the most on their education system. So Nigeria's education spending for 2021 was 5.14% of our GDP, which is a 0.01 increase from 2020. But when we look at countries that are really known for excellence in education, like South Korea, Germany, the UK, they spend between 11 and 20% of their GDP on sustaining their education, right? So not just building, but sustaining, right? Because they've already built. Now, what that tells me is that we actually need to probably spend much more than them because we haven't built the foundation. So we should really be doubling down and heavily investing. And Abubakar spoke about, seeing education as an asset and seeing people as an asset and actually looking at it as an investment and not a cost center. And I think that, to me, that really, resonated a lot of my own thinking as well. So Abubakar, I'd like you to, dive a little bit deeper on that. Can you shed more light on how do we currently determine this percentage, right? And how much should we ideally be allocating to truly transform education in Nigeria?
Thank you very much. Well, first, let me say figures are fascinating. Figures are important, but they don't tell the whole story. For one, the figures, I don't know the sources, but I want to say here that no reliable data page shows that any country in the world spends up to 20% of its GDP, not the annual budget. No country, the highest spenders on education in the world, Sweden, Norway, Israel, Canada, they hover between 6.something% to 7%. Highest recorded by World Bank data also was 7.6% of the GDP on education. Nigeria's figure of 5.01% is not true. For one, we don't have reliable figures, but two, it is not up to 5, it's not up to 4, it's not up to 3, it's not up to 2%. So I'm just questioning to say this, but as I say, the important thing is the issue of the investment. Everybody accepts that education is the driving force of development, social, political, economic development across the world. You must invest heavily in education. I was enjoying the comments by the Vice Chancellor of Pan-Atlantic. And I remember just last month, some people connected with the Nigerian Economic Summit group visited me, and there was serious argument on whether brain drain is negative or positive. We were not even sure. Should we be lamenting that some of our best brains are leaving the country? Some say yes, only because we do not attract some good brains from outside the country. Because some of these issues wouldn't be issues 50 years ago. It is part of the globalization. It's part of the new world where education itself is not designed to respond to the needs of the community alone. Your curriculum, the purpose of education, the content of education should aspire to respond, yes, to the needs of the country, but also to the international needs. Because, just take the banking sector and see today, banking is no more a small local thing. Banking is international. You carry your card, you go to any part of the world, your ATM card, any part of the world, you draw your money. So the issue of this global reach has really affected and shaped it. But let me come back to the issue of spending. Yes, we do not spend much. Actually, Nigeria's spending in the last 10 years has been averaging 5 to 7% of the annual budget, not the GDP. Not the GDP. Our annual budget is about 5 to 7% of the annual budget, which certainly is very low. But of course, there is a counter argument. You can argue that if you spend part of the country's money on roads, network, and so on, you are invariably also assisting education because you cannot locate schools without roads. So if you spend on power, you are also helping education because you need power in schools. If you spend on health, if you spend on this and so on. But let me say something that we tend to forget. We in the National Universities Commission believe that we have started a kind of a small revolution in the education, the university education sector in the country, but largely because of Nigerian Economic Summit Group. It was because of Nigerian Economic Summit Group. This is the group that challenged us mercilessly, led by the president somewhere there. I saw him, visited me in my office, challenged us and looked at our faces, the directors in the commission, and said, you don't seem to know what you are doing. Why do you keep feeding our university students on a very cold diet? That is the issue of curriculum. Why do you keep that idea of universities being ivory towers, where a professor will go under a tree and with a bird singing, and he will be thinking and contemplating and then come up with some of his... He says the world today will require problem solution. University education has to work with the industries to solve key problems. And that led to Nigerian universities signing an MOU with the Economic Summit Group in this hotel about 5 years ago. And I signed on behalf of the academia. The NSG signed on behalf of the industries. And I remember the Minister of Labor, Chris Ngige, was invited and signed on behalf of government to give birth to the triple helix model which we have been pursuing. So, in other words, we need to invest more in education, but we need to invest more equitably and more efficiently.
Do you have a figure?
More equitably and more efficiently. We just don't invest without us. But, well, I must commend some members of this forum who have taken up my challenge, because I challenge the forum. I say, look, what do you do then? You cannot just sit down and accuse universities when you do not intervene in universities. I do not know of how many research grants or professorial chairs have been endowed by people. But in the last few years, a lot of chairs, a lot of research grants, but more importantly, some of them have taken up the challenge and established some private universities. We work with them to establish some of them, and one is also establishing another good private university as a member of this group to say, look, let us have more competition. And with our new transnational policy, education policy we have just unveiled in the commission, we are opening our universities for more competition. In the past, it was only federal universities, for good reasons then. Later, state universities were allowed to come in to give competition to federal. From 1999, private universities started coming. Today, we have more private universities in terms of number than federal universities and state universities put together. And we hope more and more will come. So I really believe that figures are important. And you made one, and this is my last point, you made one reference to the investment, the expenditure or the budget on education. If Nigeria budgets half of its annual budget to education, the needs are so enormous. We may end up, because we need more classes, our population is growing at a very alarming rate. In the next 30 years, we are going to have over 400 million people. Nobody is talking, nobody is thinking about how many classes at the primary level we need to build every year, how many classes at the secondary school level we need to build every year,
how many tertiary education we need to, how many teachers we need to train. We're not talking of that. If Canada, Israel, which are two of the most educated countries in the world, or Japan, if they vote 5% of their GDP or their budget to education, they don't have the need to build a new classroom. They don't have a need to take light to the classroom or to do this. It's just to improve the quality of the existing school. But here with us, we don't have enough facilities, we don't have enough classes, we don't have enough laboratories, we don't have libraries, so the need for us to invest more. That's why it's not even justifiable to just say Nigeria spends 5% just because Germany, let us compare it, Germany spends 4%, so our own is higher. No, there are two different variables. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I think this was very insightful in terms of, really looking at all the different sort of layers that we have to deal with, and really looking at this is a really, really big problem to solve. And as you spoke about that as well, that it's not just looking at education, but looking at sort of all the other socioeconomic development problems that we have. And I think, one of the things as Abubakar was speaking that really, sort of stood out was that what he's talking about is just university and primary education. Is just the formal part of education, right? And Collins, I'll sort of merge two questions together for you to touch on. Abu already mentioned sort of like how can we create systems where you work and you learn and then you get your degree. In Germany and India, they have vocational trainings that create fantastic jobs and are well paid, but they are also, again, this learn and work model that then give you some kind of qualification. And depending on what you do afterwards, you can stock it up with an actual degree. The other side of that is entrepreneurship, which was also mentioned by a lot of the panelists. How do we sort of make those two more attractive? Because Abu mentioned sort of like the degree is the highest goal that everyone wants to achieve. So how do we make those other parts more attractive? How do we ensure that more people go in them? And how do we support that happening as well?
Thank you. I think before I get there, Prof, thank you very much for what you said. I just want to ask you, before I get to man, I just want to ask him something. One of the challenges...
Collins, we're running out of time.
One of the challenges I've had with the university system is we talked about the fact that we need to move this sense to educate our people for now. Because right now, education has transformed, but if the system doesn't transform to meet up, it's a problem. We've run an internship system in my office for the past 15 years, and we take people and then train them. But at the point, personally, I thought I would extend it by going to a university to teach. So I go to a university in the East, I said, I want to be a teacher. And they said, okay, but we don't have a way to employ you. And I said, no, I don't want to be employed because I'm not looking for salary. They said, okay, then the only way they can take me is to write an application that I'm going to offer this and put it in writing that I don't want to be paid. The reason I said, I'm giving as an example, it's not worked very well because I think the system couldn't accommodate me. But the reason is that all of us here are potential teachers. We're talking about transforming, retraining people. The biggest work, one of the biggest assets we have today for teaching people are people around here, people who have experience. There's no system that allows us to go back and give maybe 2 weeks in a year, 1 week in a year, to teach. And that was what I was trying to pilot, because I thought when I went to the university and spent some time, then I asked me to see whether I can bring other people. But there's no system today that allows what some universities have done. I've seen friends who became visiting teachers in Harvard, visiting teachers in Columbia. But I would like you to think about the possibility of all of us becoming resources to teach, because, look, we need to declare a state of emergency on education, because we're thinking of those who are coming, those who are in the universities now, those who are going through the system are moving very fast through the system. How do we catch as much of them as possible? Now, going to a question around entrepreneurship. or vocational education. Look, everybody doesn't have to go to university. We have to accept that. Okay? I don't think there's any country in the world where everybody goes to university. But the thing is that when you have a kid who gets to 13 years or 16 years and is out of high school, if the universities can absorb, say, 2%, or what's the percentage the universities absorb? 1%. So the other 99%, what do we do to them before they get to, say, 25 years or 22 years? I think that's a major issue we have. In the past, there have been programs around vocational education, but we're talking about universities that don't have labs, so I'm sure the same problem also goes to vocational education. So we need to have policies around how to treat this 99% of the people. I'm not sure it's the problem of the University Commission, National University Commission, but I think that getting these people educated, and even those who go to universities, I think there was a session yesterday where we talked about STEM education. I think it's also important to build the kind of workforce that Nigeria needs today. And that workforce in most countries today, because it is, again, going back to this industrial revolution where we are now, it requires people who have science, STEM background. So even when we look at the university system, we have to make sure that the people who go into the university system are going into areas that can create entrepreneurship and can build the kind of system we want. Those 99% who don't go to university, we must get them to the point where they are trained enough to fend for themselves. Now, there are local systems. For instance, we talked about the apprenticeship system in the East. That was a kind of vocational education where somebody comes out and somebody takes him and then trains him. I think that we have to look at local systems. I think we have local systems around that across the country to get people trained at whatever level, because I think that we've emphasized too much on formal education, but there's a lot of informal education that goes on that we have to codify in such a way that we can scale those things, because this 75% of youths you have, if small percentage of them go to university and the rest are out there, what are the options for them? I think in terms of if we talk about entrepreneurship, look, anybody that doesn't go to, there is a lot of reasons why people go into entrepreneurship. One is that there's simply no opportunity. If you come out of university or if you come out of high school and there's no opportunity, you go into trading, you go into whatever you can. That's entrepreneurship. The problem is not starting entrepreneurship. The problem is getting entrepreneurship to the point where it makes sense and then scales, and it cannot transform the economy. So if these 99% who don't get educated, if all of them don't get jobs, and they're all in entrepreneurship in the informal sector, how do we create systems that allow those things to educate them while they're doing their work and then help them scale? When I started entrepreneurship, one of the best helps I got was from IFC. My company was small then, and it was through EDC, part of the Pan-Atlantic University. And EDC comes and gives a fund, IFC comes and gives a fund to IFC and says, companies at this scale, we're going to give them a 75% grant to formalize the accounting system, simple accounting system. And with this accounting system, I got an IFC consultant to come and spend 3 months with us and teach us how to have an accounting system and a financial system. It transformed my company. Now, how do we have systems that we can go and look at people at that level, or even at a lower system, and teach them basic, even with bookkeeping, so that the trader out there understands how to use bookkeeping to transform his business. Now, it is at that level we have to look at to make sure that anybody who says, I don't have opportunity for work, or I want to go into formal entrepreneurship, there's a system that allows him to transform himself while he's in that system, and it also educates him along the way.
Thank you so much. And to what you just mentioned, I think Bank of Industry actually does some of that, where they actually have funds for intervention into micro businesses as well as SMEs, and not just money, but also consultancy services that sort of go hand in hand with that. But I guess we just need to scale it.
The scale is, I think the scale is the most important. There are a lot of things, there are bits and pieces all over the place, but I think we need to get to the point where that scales to the level of the problems we have currently.
Okay. So I would like the audience to get ready with questions, but I'm going to ask one more question to Chineye. And the question is around, we've heard all of these different sort of sides of the coin, right? And there's so many facets to it. How do we use policy to strategically drive the actual, sort of implementation of that? And someone mentioned that, I think it was Abu that mentioned the complexity of policy making, and that you also have to look at how do you localize policy making in order to make it more relevant. So what role does policy play in all of this, and how does it become a strategic lever to actually create success?
So that's the big elephant in the room, and well, there are many elephants in the room. The way I think about this is that as a country, as a nation, we haven't yet accepted certain realities. And the more we run away from those realities, the more difficult it is for us to actually create the policy that we need to put in place. It's a reality, for instance, that we know that the majority of Nigerian children will not go to university. We know that because the the carrying capacity of the universities is never going to get to the pace at which our population is growing. And so accepting that your child will not go to university, or the children in your community or whatever may not go to university, is a big obstacle. So long as we continue to resist that, then we don't open up to other options. The second part is that we have to recognize and accept, and with due respect to what Prof was saying about numbers, what is our present reality? Let's look at it this way. The average if you go to the advanced industrial countries, a classroom is 25 people, 25 children. And when you scale it to 35 or 40. So let's assume that there are, just for purposes of my math is bad, so let's assume that there are 40 million children that need to go to school in Nigeria. If we're going to have 40 of them per class, that's 1 million classrooms. Second reality, we will never build 1 million classrooms. That's never going to happen. And once we know that that's never going to happen, it begins to inform policy. We know we must go to classrooms without walls. And what then do we need to do to deliver classrooms, borderless classrooms, classrooms without walls? That becomes a priority of policy. A third reality is that when we look, and I mentioned the numbers earlier, and they're very difficult. Nobody likes education numbers. They're really frightening. In fact, they're paralyzing when you think about it. What is the problem that we have with these children when they get to the age of 13? The problem is that when they get to the age of 13, the foundational literacies that they're supposed to have at primary 6, they do not have at JS3. And in many cases, they don't even have at SS1. And so these children, not having given them those foundational literacies of numeracy and reading itself, being able to read in any language and construct sentences, and then all the other competencies that go around that, problem solving, collaboration, critical thinking, all those things are crippled. And by the time that child is graduated through our system, through basic education, the child is just not ready for tertiary of any sort, whether it is academic or it is technical and vocational. And so if we don't go back to and solve the problem at the basic level, we're simply going to be pushing these children through. And we get to the stage where we have literally dysfunctional young people who are just not prepared and don't have capacity to actually engage and make themselves productive. Number 4, that will come to mind is that, and I did mention this number, when you think about it, you can't have a country that has a total gross enrollment in TVET of 540,000. I'm even scared to calculate what that means in terms of percentages. This is exactly the opposite. So in the SME space, we talk about 43 million SMEs. If every SME in this country has one person, that's 43 million people, and you take that out of your 200 million, right? So if every SME is employing 2 people, you're talking about almost 90 million. The question is, who is working in those places? What's their capacity? And when you dig, you'll find that these people are victims of this system that we've had. Let me say, what is the challenge with TVET? 2 things. Perception. We have, as a culture and as a country, decided that the only education worth having is a university degree. And yet we have not been able to expand the capacity for Nigerians to access that. The alternate is technical and vocational education. And we used to have things like city and guilds in the 1970s, 1980s. And all over the world, there is no country in the world where university education is the most important education of the workforce. There's no country in the world. In fact, the data is showing that a country needs to get to 8% of its population with tertiary education to begin to impact GDP. 8% before it begins to impact GDP. And so we are at 1% of our population, and we have been. The second problem with TVET is cost. When we talk about education, you have to look at general education and then technical education. The ratio, the cost ratio between technical and vocational is very simple for you to think about. So one classroom, one chemistry lab, in Nigeria today, a chemistry lab would cost about 1.5 million naira. That's before the naira went the way it has gone in the last few months. How many labs are we going to build? For over 40 years, Nigeria has had an exam that we call Alternative to Practical. Alternative to Practical is an exam that you take because you cannot do the practical. Why can't you do the practical? There are no classrooms. There are no labs. So if we're going to build in our 7,000 schools, we want to build one chemistry lab, one physics lab, one biology lab, one ICT lab. Do the number 7,000 by approximately 10 million at the cost in 2021. And that's the kind of investment that we're talking about. It's not going to happen. I'm sorry, I know it's upsetting. I have to apologize, but you have to deal with the facts. Let's face the reality. The reality is that the country that cannot even fund the current level of education that we have and the state kind of education that we have requires to over-invest in technical and vocational, where 70 to 80% of its children are going to end up in that space. And we have not invested for over 40 years. How do we change that? We have to solve the problem, beginning from policy perspective, which is, as a nation, we all have to come to common agreement around what is this education picture going to be 10, 20 years from now. Not what we desire it to be, but what is it really going to be, extrapolating from what we currently know. And the answer, a part answer to that, I've already given, which is that as a country, we need to shape policy around the future workforce, right, that is based on our current reality. And I keep seeing this over pivot, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of tertiary and in terms of this issue of JAPA, right? So the Institute of Migration says, from their own research, in the past 2 decades, the total number of people who have left Nigeria, this so-called JAPA, has never gone above 0.7% of our population. So what that means is that in 20 years, not up to 1% of our people have left this country seeking this greener pastures. The 99%. Within that 1% that have left, the challenge that we should be understanding, and that's the fifth, and I'll just stop there, is that it tells us if our system is shaky and even about collapsing because 0.7% as at 2027 of our population left, then it means that we're doing something really wrong for the other 97.3%. Something's wrong. And if we don't fix that thing, we ain't going anywhere. And fixing it means policy, like you've correctly pointed out. Our policy must point to must based on the realities, must then create a framework that says we're going to create education that's fit for purpose, that employs the largest number of people and gives them the capability to actually become effective earners. And the connection to that is this. You get to senior secondary 1. Remember I said 14%. Yes, I'm rounding up. You get 14% of your JS3 going into senior secondary 1. At the end of senior secondary 1, less than, by the time you get to senior secondary 3 will be there. Out of, if you have 10 who go in SS1, 3 will end up in SS3. Of the 3, only 1 is going to come out with 5 credits. And so those people are now what you now have to deal with. The question is, if you went into technical and vocational at the same time, the guy who goes to university is going to spend 3 years in senior secondary, 5 years to get a degree, that's 8 years. The person who goes into technical and vocational starts earning from senior secondary 1. Because he's effectively engaged with industry, like Abu was saying. And so the child who goes through technical and vocational becomes a productive income earner 8 years ahead of the university students. And that's where the problem lies.
And that's what's happening in Germany, for example, where you can leave school after 9 years and you go into that vocational segment, and within 3 years, you're contributing to the economy.
Exactly.
I think we need to go over to questions. So I've got some questions from online, but I'm going to take 2 questions from the audience. So very hard to choose. Okay, I'll take one over there. The man in black with the white lanyard. It's you. And then I'll take one from the lady there in the middle. Yes. And please, questions. We won't take comments.
Thank you very much. My name is Sadiq Usman. I work at Flour Mills of Nigeria PLC. My question is regarding collaboration with industry. Would like to find out specifically from the academics that we have on stage. What efforts are you making to improve that collaboration with industry, and what efforts do you think can be made by industry? Because I'm very curious, how many universities in Nigeria have commercial entities, for instance, that commercialize their research? Are they even allowed to do that? In this fourth industrial revolution, how many academics in Nigeria have any kind of patent in technology? How many have ever invented something or tried to commercialize something? So because if you want to work with industry, there needs to be a basis to work together. So I'm just curious to understand that. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we'll take the lady at the back. She's over there in the middle segment. While we get the microphone to her, I am going to quickly read the questions from the online audience. So one question was around, why do we establish more universities when the existing institutions are deficient in capacity, competencies, and can't accommodate the existing needs? And how do we sort of build on what we have to make it better and more efficient, instead of just saying we need more and we need, more of the same type? The second question was, what role do polytechnics play in job creation, and how can we utilize them properly? And then the last question from online is, expectedly our focus is on technology and the jobs that it can create. Are there other sectors and methods of job creation we should be preparing for our youth? And then we'll take this question.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ronke Kusoko, CEO of Employment Clinic. When power was privatized, there was a manpower gap of about 40,000. The federal government spent a lot of money on gap analysis and all that through NAPTIN. And the only institution, there was no institution, even NAPTIN that could handle the manpower gaps, except for Siemens and General Electric that had the needed capacity then. 40,000 engineers, linesmen, cablesmen, fitters, and all that were needed by Nigeria. And only in 2022, only the Lagos state government just signed the technician part with Siemens finally, because that gap had to be filled. Now, I want to ask, because I work in the specific technical industry, that what is the plan of NUC, the academia, and all that for maritime education? We are not permitted to make comments. I would have talked about the practicality. But when you need maritime insurers, media and communication, business management, and all that, a whole gamut, about 50 aspects of skills. I'm not saying I've spent 10 years, and I'm not saying in the next 10, 20 years that we can provide what is needed, except to innovate, which we have done. But what is the plan of this people representing different organizations in the private and public sector on maritime education? I think I would like to leave it at that.
Thank you so much. And then the CEO had a comment. So if we can get the mic to him quickly before we take answers. We'll just take the comment quickly.
Thank you very much. Again, Professor Rashid gave me up, and I want to thank you for opening the door. From what you've heard, it's simply that industry is saying we signed an MOU, but we have not operationalized it effectively, and that is delaying it. The only area you allowed us to do curriculum review was the entrepreneurship, and you can see. So there is a lot that can be done. If I would have asked my people is that work we did should be put on the app so that everybody can read. I'm glad that in the last 3 months, we are beginning to talk about operationalizing it. Industry want to help, but you see, just as it took us time to break the trust between private sector and public sector, we again are facing that problem with academia. It's not Professor Rashid. He's opened his door. But there are many people at the back end that is not allowing all this exchange program, those in academia coming to industry, those of us supporting. We've talked about how we can leverage technology. And there are people that have volunteered to use technology in a number of things. It's simply saying there is a burning platform and when you take it now. If you had started that, maybe the impact of JAPA will have been limited 5 years ago till now. So that's why I just say I'm commenting.
Thank you.
I'm glad you're back to getting it work, but let's do it quickly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Can I go?
Yes.
Because I think they are getting too many. I will only touch some, and then my colleague here can fill in the gaps. Let me start from the last, sir. Thank you very much for provoking this latest response. You were at the helm when we signed the MOU, and I am happy you now seem to shift the blame for not implementing it on us, while on our side, we shift it squarely on you, because squarely we shift it on the private sector, on the Nigerian Economic Assembly Group, because I think what we cannot dispute is that there is mutual arrogance on both sides. The academics have their own arrogance. You people, sir, have your own arrogance. You do not necessarily value us the way we think we should be valued. And some of the, I don't know how to use words, but some of the people within the academic cycle also are unnecessarily being ill-informed about the benefits of the collaboration. He started asking a question of, say, how can we, one of the things I talk to vice chancellors whenever I hold meetings with them is how do we break this tie? A professor of engineering who spent 30 years in the university, from being a graduate assistant, rising to become a professor, but who has never worked in the industry, is just deceiving himself. He can continue to theorize, he continue to teach the students according to this man, according to that man, but he hasn't seen the truth, hasn't seen the reality. So if we are to transform our university education, if we are to rethink the purpose, if we are to rethink the content, we need to rethink the methodology of delivering the content to get the purpose right. And that is to say, we must involve those people who are really educated. You have to draw a line between certificates, and education. Even when I was a young undergraduate student, I knew of His Excellency Pascal, emeritus professor of everything as far as we are concerned. Why do we, when Alex Ferguson, who was barely educated, barely, I don't think he has a secondary school, but because for 2 decades and some years, he emerged as the most successful football coach in the world, having gotten more trophies, 46 of them, than any coach in the history of football. When he retired from Manchester United, Harvard University invited him to come and, in a way, in the Nigerian context, teach the students in management, in business, how he created a successful business model at Manchester United, how he created success. Success. How did he succeed? People wanted to share. He talked about 2 years teaching. Now, in the Nigerian context, some of our colleagues will ask you for your PhD before you teach. Will say this, look, we are working with our colleagues to understand that when some of you offer to enter the classroom to teach and inject some measure of practical experience, relevance, as well as credibility to the system, we should all warmly welcome that rather than rebuff the idea. We should welcome it. And we are going to do this. We shall continue to talk to our colleagues. We shall create the necessary conditions. But on your side, sir, we say you seem to invest more in foreign universities than you do in Nigerian universities. Many of our industrialists in Nigeria spend more to support Harvard, to support some universities outside the country than to support our own. Yes, the argument may be by my friend who was raising questions about the patents, about the viability, that you don't want to move in where success has not already been achieved. But I thought it is, as an emerging system, it is your intervention that will help to create the kind of success we associate with the foreign universities. Sometimes we used to think, well, because most of you, the roots of your companies are outside, so you don't want to support us. We don't see many.
So how do we do what the other question asked? How do we make the existing institutions better? And then I would like to move on with the
how
questions.
to make it better, we are already, this kind of discussion, believe me, for me, this is one of the most important discussions taking place about education at all. Because the misconceptions about education, university education, education in general, at least the one we are thinking of, should be able to help us do 4 things. Once you have a good education, then it allows you to learn more. You continue to learn. Almost all of you are learning every day, either through practical experience, through discussions also. 2, it will also help us to do. Now, doing is what all of us just think. That is the issue of skilling, reskilling, upskilling. You do, and this is nothing better than in the private sector. And there are so many other things education helps us to do, but it also helps us to live peacefully and harmoniously. If we are educated and we are fighting and we disrespect one another, we don't defer to others, we should question our education. We should question our education. Where you see professors or highly educated people shouting war songs in the country, you know that we are doomed.
Yes.
Because
Thank you so much.
higher education in particular, should teach us to respect ourselves, to live peacefully, harmoniously, to respect differences. We should respect differences. The fact that I wear a cap and he doesn't wear a cap, we should respect that. When I pray differently, he prays differently. My education and his education tells us that my praying differently and his praying differently is not a barrier for a close working relationship and so on. So
thank you.
Sorry. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I just need to make sure that we get through the other questions. And I think I'd like to sort of distribute the questions. So Abu, I'd like you to take the one on collaboration with industry and the commercialization of R&D and sort of the role of patents. Chinenye, I'd like you to speak on the role of polytechnics and how we can, sort of leverage them more. And Enase, I'd like you to speak on the gaps in maritime, and if that's not your specialization, just the gaps in general. How do we bridge those gaps within different industries? right, by private-public sector, that handshake that has to happen between the two industries in order for us to bridge those gaps. So it doesn't have to be specific to maritime, because I think that's a very specific question. And then Collins, if you can talk to what are the other sectors outside of technology that we can leverage. And please, everyone, in like 30 seconds or so.
Okay, unfortunately, this can't happen in 30 seconds. Otherwise, I just keep it. How do we fund it? That's how I'm going to rephrase the question. I think the most important thing that we must address before leaving here is that do we have a model to fund all of these exciting ideas? And I'm going to share what we have done so that it's a practical thing, and I don't have to apologize like Chinenye who painted a stark reality. The practical thing we've done is to say that we cannot achieve any of the objectives, whether it is having alignment between industry and academia, or whether it is ensuring that we can scale for the number of people. None of that can happen unless we decentralize the educational model. In other words, the universities need to all leave their campuses and come into the workplace. We cannot put enough people into the university. The university must come into the workplace. And the way it happens is, it's very simple. I have a sense of what I need for the first year of work. I want to be able to sit down with the university and design a program that means that I can train bankers for the entry-level job within 12 months. And in that 12 months, they are doing entry-level job. I need to design another program for the next 2 years, and so on and so forth. But how do we make sure that that is paid for? First and foremost, you must shorten the time it takes to educate people for the jobs that we have. We cannot be educating people 4 years for a degree 40 years ago, and it still take 4 years today. There must be some benefit from all of the achievement we have in technology, in capacity. You need to shorten the time, because if you don't shorten the time, you cannot shorten the funding. Secondly, you need to place the people in the place of work so that the method for payments start to be tied to the place where they are working and likely to continue to work. So that's why I say the university must come into the campus. Thirdly, and thanks to Professor Rashid and the work they've done, we need to bring in capacity from those who are building digital platforms for education, so that we have a lot more people contributing to the educational process. Fourthly, and again,
And
lastly, Chinenye mentioned something about the capacity that we have, and I think Enase also said it. A lot of people who can contribute to educating children today, and you brought it up, are in the workplace. The vast majority of people that were brilliant and did so well in school are sitting down in the workplace, and they can give us 2, 3, 4 hours a week. That is what we need to effectively grow the number of faculty, but they have to be put through some formal process so that it is done right. And finally, whatever we do with digital technology, we have to still go back to the campus so that people get the benefit of an experience in the campus environment. And to make sure this can happen, we've built a platform called Unify, which is enabling all of these stakeholders come on a single platform and enabling the bank to actually fund the education, because we cannot wait for government to fund this particular part of education.
Fantastic. Chinenye, over to you. 30 seconds. I know you can do it.
Yes, it's always difficult to keep me to 30 seconds or something. But let me say that I'm very excited, because I think there's an opportunity, and we just have to find the courage to embrace that opportunity. When we get the numbers, they're very scary, but we are very hardy people as Nigerians, and we just have to figure out how do we optimize for education, right? The problem we have is this: we are still building and working on a 19th century philosophy for education, and we're in the 21st century. And what do I mean by that? When we think about a polytechnic or a school, we think about the physical building. We think about the space where you aggregate people. The unit economics doesn't work anymore. The reason why we're challenged with education costs, for example, is that every unit that you bring in, every additional student or faculty that you bring into that structure, that same space, now has to have a place to live, has to have an office, etc., etc. All those things build up. And what ends up happening is that the cost of education becomes prohibitive. So what do we need to do? We need to rethink the education model, the model for schools, and going directly to the polytechnics, rather than think of a location where you bring 10,000 people and you now have to provide facility for them. Disaggregate the model and make every single mechanic shop a polytechnic. Make every single hairdressing salon a school. Make every, we need to, like Abu says, take the education out of these structures, this academia and academic type thinking, and take them into the workplace. Because every single one of those 43 million SMEs is a school. It can teach something. But imagine a situation where your mechanic earns credits for taking on students. Everybody who is an apprentice is working towards getting a degree. Imagine where the guy or the lady or the man who is in a hotel is able to go to school in between the time when guests arrive, because he's able to use 5G and connect to a learning experience, and is no longer supposed to finish a degree or a course in 2 years, but pacing it at the time. The whole idea of an 18th or 19th century school model, we have to demolish it, and we are lucky because there's an opportunity for us to do so. What is missing is having the courage to reimagine the school model and solve for our problems, not for the problems of any other country.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will just briefly speak to the points that you've made. I do agree that every SME presents a sort of school for people to learn. But I think that Abu knows that when we even look at SMEs and their lifespan, the leading causes of failure is either the lack of skills or lack of finance. So before we begin to train people within those SMEs, we need to be sure that they also have the requisite skills that can be transmitted to people. So when I look at the gaps that we see in terms of how are we preparing people and what are we preparing them for, we've all spoken about the need for a national policy, but I would like us to look at the needs of the future rather than the now. We all know, for many years we've been talking about our over-dependence on oil. We've been saying, let's do agriculture, let's do that. But I think that there are very new jobs that are created in different industries, and we need to look at how are we preparing people for those. And the courses that exist in Nigerian universities, are they still relevant in today's world? Or are there new ones that we need to ask the regulators to approve for us to be able to do that? But one of the things, I think, to address the question of the first gentleman that spoke about what are we doing in order to foster this collaboration. We said a lot about that today. But I think that perhaps the funding model of the tertiary education is something that we need to look at and perhaps gets in the way of our collaboration with industry. So when we look at the fact that half of our universities are federal and state universities and rely on subventions, we need to think about whether that in itself may stifle innovative ways of preparing themselves to be able to attract funds from private sector. And in order to do that, you need to be relevant to the needs. Of course, there's also the problem of the predictability of those funds. But when our mode and our model is really that we wait, we receive this to be able to go on to do things, there's no incentive to make ourselves attractive, for collaboration with the private sector. So I think that I would encourage us to, within the university system, to be more creative in seeking alternative sources of funds. Because if I want someone to come and endow a chair at my university, the person has to have the confidence that by endowing that chair, the research that's going to come out is something that's beneficial to them. Therefore, I have to position myself. And by the way, it's not everything that we do that necessarily translates into patents. So more or less, we're working, of course, on the technical things. You create an invention, you go there. But if it is that we're focused on evidence-based solutions that industry finds relevant, so again, the mode and our thinking within universities has to change. The other thing is that when we also talk about the funding of things, and with due respect, ES, perhaps also the ways that, we look at things, and you've commented about the way, we may be stuck in the old ways in which we've always done things. So, for instance, on my campus, if I want to create a multi-purpose facility that can be used from different schools, I may be marked down when people come for accreditation because they're saying to me, you need this space, you need these labs to be able to, for me to give you this. And I'm thinking, that's costly, it's expensive, I'm not going to put it to good use, but I do not have the liberty to create such a multi-purpose thing. So there's structural barriers that we have to address, there's a problem of mindset that we have to address, but altogether, again, to emphasize the point I made at the beginning, if we recognize that between industry and academic, we have a mutual dependence on one another, then we will seek to see what are the things we can do and the ways we can work better in order to create a workforce that is future ready. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Collins has promised me that,
30 seconds.
Yes, so your time.
But 30 seconds means about 5 minutes, so you have to.
No, 30 seconds.
Okay, somebody asked about why is the opportunity mostly in technology? I think that it is mostly because of the nature of technology itself. Technology is an early adoption industry, and a lot of times they adopt what they build first. So for instance, that makes it easy for technology, for instance, in education, to create platforms to educate people that they want for the industry. If you were here, if you were around in the, about 15 years ago, you notice this company called NIT. They were all over Nigeria. They essentially built universities across Nigeria to train the workforce needed for the industry. So all of us went to NIT. I was going to NIT to recruit. I didn't care whether you were a graduate or not. And they created that, and it kind of helped us build the workforce we needed. When technology evolved again, and we could adopt that online, NIT phased out. And today, technology is delivering what it needs online. And anybody, anywhere in the world today can go online and get, whether you're educated or whether you're in the university or not, and get training for the technology industry. And because technology is global, once you get that, you become employable globally. Perhaps that's a model we need to adopt. You do not need universities to teach people how to do technology. If you look at companies like Google today, they're beginning to think that universities are outdated and are developing curriculum that allows people to be trained in 6 months to become the workforce that we need for the technology industry. And that's going to happen. So, 30 seconds gone.
Yeah.
You tried.
Thank you so much. And I would like to thank all the members of this panel. I think this has been a really insightful discussion. And I think for me, the key takeaways really are that we have to have the courage to think out of the box. We have to have the courage to throw away the traditional models and create our own, the ones that will work for today as well as the future. And we must invest in people, policy, and partnerships. And we have to make sure that we really, I guess, accelerate the educational system in a way that by rethinking it, we shorten the cycles that it takes to actually produce quality talent, and that we also look at how do we achieve this and how do we set aside this arrogance on both sides that Abubakar talked about. And I love the honesty that you brought to this panel. I think it's really important for all of us to hear, because it's easy to point fingers, but I think all of us, this is our responsibility as individuals, as organizations, and as nation builders. So with that, I'll leave you. Thank you very much.
Well, a panel that has two professors and private sector operators that are also professorial, they should have been given 5 hours. Let's put our hands together for them, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Chairman, please join us here. So while the photograph is going on, let me quickly inform you that we have eaten into the breakout session time. So very quickly, you show interest. The first one will be transparency and accountability, priorities for effective governance. Floor MQ at the main hotel there, room Barunu and Anambra Hall. That's there between now and 12 noon. The second breakout session will be on floor M1, Niger and Enugu Hall, and the focus will be on monetary policy management in challenging times. Floor M1, Niger, Enugu Hall. The third one will be on research and innovation, pathways to industrialization for economic prosperity. Floor M1, Benue Plateau Hall. The third one will be on floor M2, universal coverage and the basic health care funds, Imo, Rivers, and Cross River Hall. I would also like to say my colleague is standing by to interview members of the panel. Ola Ogunano, that's him, my colleague, he'll be interviewing you. They're eradicating learning deprivation. Floor M1, Lagos, Oshun Hall. And then the final one will be the sixth breakout session, will be election and succession planning. Floor M2, Ogun, Nasarawa Hall. Those are the breakout sessions. It will be happening between now and 12 noon. Let's be back here for the 5th plenary session, the closing plenary at 12:30 p.m.